Thank you very much for that very insightful speech there. A lot to chew on. After definitely needs to be worked on if it will bring us the benefits that we all look to. So thank you very much once again for that speech. Now our next speaker will be speaking about democracy in Africa. And I'm very passionate about this because this is really, really at the heart of all of this. It is at the heart of all of this. And like you mentioned, we can talk trade, we can talk investment, we can talk everything. If we ignore the politics of it, the leadership of it, then there'll be a problem. And so we're very fortunate this afternoon to have with us a senator in Nigeria. And he is a member of the Nigerian Senate. Senator Ibrahim Hadija is here with us, and he will be speaking to us about reviewing democracy in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together. Let's welcome him to speak to us. And then after that, we'll have that panel discussion on the same subject, reviewing democracy in Africa. And my colleague Benjamin Akato will be leading on that.
Thank you very much, moderator. Your Excellencies, CEOs, business leaders, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I was drafted to, I was coming here to be part of a panel discussion, and I was only drafted to give the keynote address, I think, yesterday. So I'm very glad, and it was a strange topic to me at first because we're coming to an economic summit and we're talking about democracy. But I think in the first panel, one of the speakers made the very, very clear connection between politics and business or the economy. And certainly, especially in Africa, the economy or robust economy and a political unrest, I think, make very, very strange bedfellows. So I'd like to start really by, talking about what democracy means to different people. Because the definition of democracy, as we understand it, the generic definition, elections, rule of law, term limits, and so on and so forth. Some argue that this is really a definition as set out by the West, and maybe we need to look at ourselves and define our own democracy. And it's very, very tempting also to say that democracy as practiced in the West maybe is not working very well in Africa, and the topic is essentially for us to find alternatives. I'm not going to talk about alternatives. I think I'll leave that for the panel discussion. But I think, before delving into the various pros and cons, we need to understand that Africa essentially only began to experience self-rule in the 60s. I think with countries like Ghana, which was one of the first countries to get independence, setting the pace, and the transition to multi-party elections taking hold from the 90s onward with the occasional military interruption. A lot of political scientists talk about some preconditions that should be in place before democracy can take root. Two of the major ones are a cohesive national identity and a reasonably strong economy supported by a robust middle class. And if we look at Africa in the 60s, I don't think any of this would be, seem to apply to most of the countries that actually transitioned to democracy then. So Africa actually bucked the trend, so to speak. Lee Kuan Yew says democracy is not appropriate in a country whose economy is weak and which does not have a middle class that constitutes between 60 to 70% of the population. And he was talking about Burma, not even an African country. However, almost all the African democracies, except maybe South Africa, entered multi-party politics with a low GDP per capita, very high unemployment rate, and a colonial hangover based on resource exploitation rather than nation building. A lot of these countries also had some period of military rule, and the constitutions and political systems were essentially bequeathed by the military, often without looking inwards or considering economic, cultural, and demographic considerations. So if multi-party democracy as defined and practiced in the West, where the 10 oldest uninterrupted democracies are an average of 150 years old and are still far from perfect, maybe it would be correct to say it's still in the formative stage on the African continent. My take is our perception of our democratic status as a continent has been shaped largely by a steady dose of Afro-pessimism by the press, both local and international. Africa gets bad press in a lot of respects. Just like we had, most of the economic potentials are underreported. And it seems that the only thing worth reporting about Africa is crisis, war, and the violence that almost precedes elections. But I think we deserve more of a positive outlook if we look at the fact that, like I said, we are practicing something that essentially bequeathed to us without most of the conditions in place. It's true that in Africa, electoral stakes are extremely high, and the average African politician will hardly concede an electoral defeat. So the furor that follows African elections, sometimes degenerating into violence and unrest, also helps fuel this negative vibe. But let's not forget, again, that we're essentially working with an alien doctrine that we embrace without adaptation. Just like we have challenges with democratic practice in Africa, we also have these challenges in Europe, Asia, Latin America. In fact, there are African countries that are not a good example of an ideal democracy. We also have our shining stars, and we can learn from what they're getting right instead of overgeneralizing the continent. Unlike my elder brother, the Minister of Environment, I'm not going to mention any names because he's an elder, and as I look around this room, I can see some people that can still knock my head. So let's just take it from the continental perspective. But I think we're also making steady progress. In the late 60s, 80% of African heads of state left power unconstitutionally through coups, wars, or revolutions. Today, 80% are in power through a constitutional process due to elections, expiry of term limits, death in office, or resignation. Again, there's a study by the Elections Integrity Project, which essentially gave a ranking of 1 to 10 in terms of quality of democracy in the regions. Naturally, Europe and America are top. I think they got a score of about 8.9. Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa got 4.9, but Asia got 4.8. And Sub-Soviet Europe got even lower. So even from a global perspective, African democracy cannot be said to be the worst. Yes, there are countries that will drag us down, but we also have, like I said, our success stories. And if we look at the fact that, we're talking about a question of the connection between democracy and the economy, then certainly we cannot be said to be at the lowest end of the ladder. I must also make the point that in seeking for alternatives to the African democratic situation, we need to understand that democracy is not a perfect art form anywhere. And if we look at the drama that has characterized the global political arena in the last 20 years or so, with the emergence of far-right groups, manipulation of the electoral process, and even a degeneration to violence, as we saw in the United States. The American elections coming up, I think, in November will be very, very interesting, looking at what has happened in the previous election. About 74 million Republicans who voted. If you poll them today, a good percentage of them will still tell you that the election was stolen and Trump is the rightful president. And, it makes you wonder, democracy and administration, looking at it from our own perspective. Someone like Trump, probably the most fact-checked president in the world, 90% of most of what he says are essentially not true. But he still has that following with the American public. He still has these crazy ideas. And somehow, you know, if you had an election today, it will not be much of a surprise if Trump makes it back. Is that an ideal portrait of a democracy? You know, should we say to ourselves that maybe we should have a democracy where you have items in place that can maybe checkmate some of these extreme leaders that we are seeing emerge in the Western world? You know, there are challenges that are common to all democracies. You know, manipulation, like I said. In looking at the African context, we are living in a world now where social media is playing, or manipulation of social media is playing a significant role in election outcomes. We've seen Cambridge Analytica, which is probably the most famous, where close to, you know, almost 78 million people had their data stolen and manipulated. And manipulated in a way that where their mindset was being changed, essentially without them knowing. A lesser known, you know, one came up not too long ago called Project Hohei, run by an Israeli. And this is a company, this goes well beyond what Cambridge Analytica did, because essentially a company that said they intervened in 33 countries, and out of those 33, they got a positive outcome in 27. And a lot of these countries are in Africa. Again, I'm not going to mention any names, but let's know that it went beyond what happened in Cambridge Analytica. They not only accessed people's data, they hacked into emails, and then you know, they had bots, essentially robots that, email robots that were essentially going out there, creating fake stories, you know, demeaning opponents, and so on and so forth. And like I said, they claim to have gotten a success rate of almost 80–90%. This is all over, but I'm quite particularly worried about how this will affect us in Africa, because our gullibility factor is very high. You know, anybody here that is on a WhatsApp group, family WhatsApp group, school group, will know the kind of crazy stories that people forward, and they lap it up, you know. So if you have a situation where any crazy thing would be treated as gospel truth, then God help us if you have a situation where we move to a stage where artificial intelligence, as it is now, we get to a point where elections can be won or lost, you know, based on how much you invest in social media manipulation. Like I said, I will not like to go into the details of if we have alternatives to democracy, but certainly I think we should look at the fact that, assuming we find an alternative in this gathering, how do we implement it? You know, the only way, you know, most of the constitutions and political systems bequeathed on us were bequeathed by the military. So unless you have a truncation in the administration, you know, it's almost impossible for you to have a change of political system in Africa. Yes, some of the countries have constitutional amendment clauses, but these are very, very difficult. And, you know, I don't see, for example, we complain about it, I'm a senator, it says, there's the argument that democracy is too expensive, Nigerian senators are the highest paid senators in the world, which is not true, but I don't see a parliament sitting down to legislate themselves out of existence, simply because there's a call for a smaller parliament. We tried to introduce independent candidature, maybe to break the stranglehold that some of the governors have on primary elections, and it was thrown out. You know, yes, there are systems that are in place that can, you know, impact on small amendments to the constitution, but I think a general change in the political structure is almost impossible if you don't have some kind of truncation. This, I believe, is maybe some of the issues that the panel can discuss. And like I said, I hope at the end of it, we may have these alternatives. But not only should we have the alternatives, we should also look at how we can implement them within the existing context. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Senator. And you have really just set the stage for us for that conversation. And my colleague Benjamin Akatbo will be moderating that. Benjamin, if you could just come down But as you mentioned, Senator, if Africa is doing slightly better than Asia when it comes to democracy, why is the gap so yawning when it comes to the economy? Which is why we must have this conversation. Maybe our understanding of multi-party democracy, the way we are doing it, is just not helping us. And so I look forward to this brutally frank conversation, which will be moderated by my very eloquent colleague, Benjamin Akato. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll put our hands together for you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hear we're hard-pressed for time, so we'll have to make tracks. I would like to quickly invite the panel members to assume their seats. We just heard from Senator Ibrahim Hadejia. Please, respectfully. Member of the Nigerian Senate. Let's put our hands together for them as they come forward. We also have B. Elias Shonin. If you're here, please. Former Deputy Foreign Minister, Republic of Liberia. Yes, he spoke earlier. Professor Ludeki Chweya, CEO, Kenyan School of Government. Let's put our hands together for him. Robert Wanguria, CEO of the RB Company, Kenya. Do we have him? Okay, I heard that there was a possibility of his not being here. So, gentlemen, we have just about 20 minutes to play with on democracy. Senator has already established that while this is an economics summit, democracy plays a huge role in that. You can look at the IMF programs that many countries across the world are lobbying for and the role of democracy in that process. Freedom House, an NGO, wrote in 2018 that the state of democracy in the contemporary international system, including the African system, was in a state of dramatic decline. And stated that dramatic declines in freedom had been observed in every region of the world. It's already been made mention of. Only 11 African states were listed as free under the Freedom Index at the time. Botswana, Mauritius, Cape Verde, Senegal, Tunisia, Ghana, Nigeria, Sao Tome and Principe, Namibia, South Africa, and Benin. Since that time, we've had a number of coups d'etats, military putches, we've had attempted coups, we have had democratic governments push their tenures through processes that in some instances you would call illegal. We've seen what has happened in the Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, among others. So the initial question I'll be posing to you, gentlemen, when you look at the state of democracy on the continent currently, what do you see? And with these categorizations of flawed democracies, hybrid democracies, authoritarian regimes, what do you think is not working for Africa? And what do you think is working for Africa when it comes to democracy and governance? I'll start with you, Senator.
Yeah, thank you very much. Once again, I'm glad you mentioned the fact that according to the report, democracy is on a decline on a global basis. Because a few years ago, when you talk about decline and reduction in quality of election, the whole focus is on Africa. So we recognize the fact that it's a global problem. What we can do, my own take is the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, we are working with something that was given to us, a one-size-fits-all solution that's given to us. And studies have also shown that despite the limitations, despite the fact that we're almost not ready for democracy based on the preconditions set out by the West, we have not been doing too badly. Some people say we're actually doing much better in multi-party democracy than in some states in the West. If you look at most of the major Western democracies, they are not essentially multi-party democracies, essentially two-party democracies. There are two main parties. We're talking about United States, we're talking of the United Kingdom. Most of them have two main parties and very, very small fringe parties that are now just making that. But in most African countries, the multi-party structure, you know, is more glaring. You know, yeah, there may be one or two dominant parties, but there are also significant players, and as we have seen recently, even in recent cases in Nigeria, it is actually possible for a third force to come in and make you know, a significant impact. Again, you know, looking at we mentioned some countries. We have some countries that, even within the Western context, are essentially best cases in terms of democratic outlook. My problem, you know, in advocating for hybrid or change or coming up with an African model is that how do you apply it within the African context? If you find a model that's very suitable for Mauritius, with a population of 2 million, or Seychelles, a small island nation with a population of 5,000, if it works there, will you now take it and apply it to Ghana, or apply it to Nigeria, 200 million, 317 ethnic nationalities? How do we, you know, let's not move away from a one-size-fits-all model that's been bequeathed to us by the West to a one-size-fits African model that we think can work from Cameroon all the way to South Africa. Yes, you know, there are certain peculiarities. Maybe we should agree on what should be a commonality. You know, free and fair elections, rule of law, term limits, and so on and so forth. And then leave the nitty-gritty maybe to the individual countries to find systems that can suit them, you know, from a cultural perspective, from an economic perspective. You know, I just mentioned the fact that democracy is expensive. Some people argue that it's a small price to pay. If we look at the gap between the economies, is it fair to take a very expensive democratic structure and impose it on a small island state, you know, that you know, is barely keeping its head above water? These are, I think, some of the issues, like I said, that we should be talking about.
Thank you so much, Senator. Let's put our hands together for him. Let me quickly move on to B. Elias Shonin, former Deputy Foreign Minister, Republic of Liberia. It took me down memory lane, 1989. I will not mention my age. I was just a boy in Monrovia fleeing that first civil war because it had broken out and we were caught right in the thick of it. House hit by mortar shells. It was a terrifying experience. You look at a country like Liberia with developments since that time through Madam Sirleaf to George Oppong Weah currently. What do you think are the highlights of democracy on the continent? The reports we keep getting will highlight Mauritius, Botswana, Ghana, among others. But within these countries themselves, there are serious problems. Some have looked at Rwanda and all that is happening there, but some have also painted that country black, calling it authoritarian. What do you think? You read from the likes of Lee Kuan Yew, from third world to first world, and you realize that something must be done. What do you feel must be done? What must be done to fill that gap?
Okay, thank you very much. When we talk about democracy, I think we need to first dissect and differentiate democracy and development. We need to figure out if there are strong correlation between the two or not. Because the context that you just asked that question gives me the sense that once there's democracy, there's supposed to be development, particularly within the context of Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore, and Kagame, Rwanda. But I believe that the model of democracy practiced by Lee Kuan Yew at the time and now Kagame are not the very popular model that have been lauded and hailed by the international community. But I believe that those are models that fit their society. Because when you look at the level of prosperity, those two societies in the context of Singapore saw, and now we're seeing in Rwanda, which many other countries in Africa are being encouraged to learn from their experience, I think it's working for them. It's working for them. But howbeit, I believe very strongly in liberal democracy, and irrespective of how one would like to interpret it. When it comes to my country, Liberia, I believe the penetration, the democratic penetration or democratization has not been even in terms of gains. At some point, we scored real high gains, and at other points, we declined. We saw a significant decline. And now, let's compare the last, let's look at the last 16 years in our post-conflict era. We got the first female elected president in Liberia, elected democratically, free, fair, transparent. And what we saw at the time, what her notion of democracy was beyond election. We saw the level of freedom, the level of free speech, and the level of open government. In her government, she had oppositions. In fact, the opposition leader, the main opposition party leader, was in her government as an ambassador of peace, and government was paying him $15,000 a month. Yeah, to run his office. And the chairman of that party also was also an assistant minister in her government. So when you look around her government, you see clearly that it was not like winner took all. She thought it was important to build a more inclusive government because that's how you gain and enjoy legitimacy. And also you reduce the level of pressure that will come out, because when you trying to think of development, and there's particularly when there's so much development needs, and you have to be thinking about suppressing a protest, a demonstration each day, it takes away. But those are part of the democratic process. So we saw an expansion, an increase in democracy at the time, and she transitioned to George Weah, and I think the transition was very democratically done, and the world hailed Liberia for that. But unfortunately, we are beginning to see decline now in our democratic pedigree, and that's why Liberia is not on that list. But I also want to make clear before I turn it back over. Electioneering is not democracy. Electioneering is a part of democracy, and I believe is the foundation of democracy. But governance is the main aspect of democracy that I think we need to focus as Africans. You see? Because to win an election in Africa is, I would say, is easier in many ways. And we must understand the context of our voting, what influence, what the motivation of African voting. In my country currently, there was an unofficial poll done because we head into election in October. An unofficial poll was carried out. We have 3 persons heading for the presidential election. We got the incumbent, George Weah. We have the former vice president under Salif, Joseph Boakai, and we got the former chief executive, the former deputy global chief executive of Coca-Cola, Alexander Cummings. And that poll results indicated, when the question was asked, among the 3 that are running, who do you think will reshape Liberia and purpose and position Liberia to sustain economic development? I'm told Edith Cummings had 60%, 61% confirmed that he could be the one. Next to him was Joseph Boakai, and then last was George Weah, the incumbent. But when the second question was asked, if election was today, who are you going to vote for? George Weah, 27%, that's the incumbent. The former vice president to Sirleaf, 25%, and Alexander Cummings, 6%. So what does it tell you? That the motivation of voting in Africa is not for progress, even though we want progress. There are a lot of factors and influence that make us to vote. Ethnicity, regionalism, relationship, religion, those are the reasons we vote. We don't vote because the person has what it takes to change Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Interesting point you made, and maybe after we're done here, since the time is so short, we shall have more of a conversation on that correlation. But coming to you then, Professor Chweya, as we've already had Mr. Shoneyin talk about governance, it quickly reminded me of Barack Obama when he first came to the continent of Africa, when he was president. He came to Ghana, and he said, you do not need strong men, you need strong institutions. I'm sure many of you recall. But what is the correlation, again, then, between strong institutions and development? In this case, economic development. Over to you, sir.
So thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this distinguished forum and for this opportunity to share some of the ideas I have on this subject. And I would like to, first of all, say this, and which forms the background to my response to the question raised. I've spent most of my academic life studying political science and taught political science at university. Then eventually I was appointed permanent secretary in government and became a senior government official, and then sat in government forums, decision-making forums, and had opportunity to have to grapple with directly with the challenges and that the population faced, to the extent that my portfolio was concerned. And now my responsibility is to develop programs to build the knowledge and skills and competencies that government officials require to discharge their duties. Now, in all of this, I have learned a lot, and I'm going to set aside my political science. I'm going to set aside my position as a government official and so on. I just want to share some ideas where from I'm now not sure anymore. First of all, human society requires two priority desires, has two priority desires. Number one is prosperity. Socio-economic prosperity and desire to fulfill the needs of life and just have good life. You want to be able to have food, health care, housing, education for your children, and so on. Transportation, you want to have comfortable living. Now, this is a primary goal. The second goal is freedom. People want to realize freedom. They want to feel they are free to realize their potential, free to express themselves, free to enter whatever enterprise they want to enter into, whatever business they want to enter into, and so on and so forth. So they want freedom. Now, there could be many others, but for my purpose this afternoon is those two. Now, freedom, the goal to realize freedom has to do with democracy as we know it now. And therefore, we could today say society desires democracy. How do you define democracy? They want to have a legitimately identified government, and that they want to have rule of law so that there is predictability and fairness in running government. And number three, they want to see accountability in the running of government. So we desire democracy, however defined. Nobody is imposing a version of democracy on Africa. When we realized independence, there was a starting point, and there was nothing wrong in having a certain starting point. And what mattered is how we adjusted that we received at the starting point over the last 60 years. So it's not fair to continue to blame the colonialists for handing down to us a model 60 years ago. The question is, what have you done to adjust that model and customize it to your needs six decades later? So that is, but we have to realize this, that even in Western Europe, democracy did not just fall down to them. They worked so hard, moving away from period of absolutist monarchical system to liberal democracy. So even for them, they have worked at it. So the point is this: democracy is work in progress. Now, in the West, it is economic prosperity that assisted in the development of liberal democracy. It is capitalism and the bourgeoisie classes, if you like, I said I won't go into political science, and the prosperous social classes that emerged in society that exerted pressure upon the absolutist monarchical system for that system to give them the opportunity to have a say in how the tax revenue they contributed to was actually shared. And that marked the beginning of the growth of liberal democracy in the West. So in short, my position is this. There is a correlation between democracy and development. In the West, it is economic development, read capitalism, that compelled the adjustment of the existing authoritarian monarchical system to begin to give way to liberal democracy. Now, then hence that's the correlation. Here in Africa, we have worked so hard to realize democracy. And we have attempted to work hard to realize economic development. But the pursuit of democracy is more vigorous than the pursuit of development. Therefore, is it possible to enjoy freedom, read democracy, in the context of poverty? It is extremely difficult. Citizens want freedom, but they also want prosperity. So if you introduce, and I must finish in 1 minute, if you introduce a highly democratic system, but do not work hard to raise prosperity, citizens will not be comfortable with you because they will ask you, shall we eat freedom? Shall we eat elections? Shall we? So if you want to protect the democratic system you have introduced, you must stimulate economic development so that citizens can realize prosperity. Now, so prosperity buttresses democracy, and democracy buttresses prosperity. Now, finally, here in Africa, and it was discussed in the earlier panel, the matter of democracy, intra-Africa trade, and so on. My point is this. Prosperity and development can only make sense if we industrialize our economies. Short of industrialization, it will be extremely difficult. Even if we say we promote intra-African trade, but we want machines, then we have to go out. So if we want to promote intra-African trade, we must stimulate industrialization. So if Kenya wants earth movers or tractors to stimulate agriculture, we should be able to buy these from Ghana. And if we want water pumps and solar panels, we should import these from Nigeria, and so on. But if Ghana produces cocoa, Kenya produces tea, so how shall we promote intra-Africa trade or trade between Ghana and Kenya? Ghana produces cocoa. We produce tea. These two serve the same purpose. Because in the morning you can either have tea or cocoa. So there is a problem. Now, with regard to global trade, if Western countries come with microchips, iPhones into the market, and we in Kenya go with leaves, tea leaves, we cannot make it. Or Ghana goes with raw gold and raw cocoa. We cannot. How many tons of tea leaves do you need to equate iPhones, iPads, and microchips? So we need to industrialize. Thank you very much.
Time is not our friend. I'll have just a final round. So I'll pose a number of questions. Each one of you can take just one in 1 minute, a maximum of 1 minute each for whatever you're going to respond to. In Ghana, we ask, now roads we go chop. In other words, will we eat roads? Based on what you said. It's also curious. Belgium or Brussels, whichever way you want to look at it, is the chocolate capital of the world. Do they produce cocoa? Switzerland, a great chunk of the banking system operates through Switzerland. It refines most of the gold across the world, 40 to 70%. Switzerland. Do they produce gold? So we are sitting on the resources, and yet, like Prof said, all the mechanized action is elsewhere. Obviously, they will develop, and you will underdevelop. It's not rocket science, is it? Anyway, I just wanted to pose these questions very quickly. We've spoken about the linkages, democracy, economic development. How do we, I remember one of you spoke about, I think it was Shoneen, how do we reorient or disabuse the minds of the African electorate to vote on issues? It may seem to be a very simple issue, but it isn't. Then, how do we contextualize our democracy? If you go in India, democracy is practiced in a specific way. If you go to Australia, it is democracy still in its own context. When I had an interaction recently with the Swiss ambassador, she made mention of the fact that 200 years ago, Switzerland was poor. And that is true. We don't go into history sometimes, we do not realize that these nations once were like we are. But it's also said that you don't reinvent the wheel. So you don't have to go and start with a square wheel when everyone is using a round wheel. You just learn and move on. She spoke about their decentralization into cantons and all of that. How can we pick these, but contextualize them and make the most of them? Whatever your thoughts are, in a minute and a half each. I'll start with you, Senator.
Thank you very much. Well, I honestly think it's a chicken and egg situation. Democracy as practiced, and under the absolute oppressing levels of poverty. There's no way, just like my colleague said, elections don't necessarily translate into democracy. And elections in these indices really make very, very little sense. So where do we start from? Do we have to focus on uplifting the economic level, get people to a point where they're thinking about other things rather than, apart from what they'll eat tomorrow? And then, of course, you now get to a point where, yes, you can start talking about issues. In the African context, or Nigerian context, I'm sure in most African countries, nobody talks about issues when you come to elections. I mean, we rather focus on baser things. We rather focus on how to induce the electorate. And it's very easy when your electorate are at a certain level of poverty. So like I said, chicken and egg situation. I don't know really how to, whether the present system will get us to a point where we've uplifted our people out of poverty. Some argue that what China achieved, lifting 400+ million people out of poverty within a short time, will not happen under the normal democratic context because of the various push and pulls within that system. So, it's unfortunate. And again, just like you mentioned, you don't have to, we can leapfrog with the right visionary leadership. I think with the right collaboration from the African perspective, we don't have to go through the long process.
Right.
We're technological age, all you have to do is focus on what you want, collaborate, and leapfrog to a point, where you get to where you want to be. We need to have in place policies that protect our local industries. The West didn't industrialize overnight. And if you look at what is happening now, most of the very, very stringent conditions, whether it's come to trade or whatever, that they put in order for them to develop domestically, they are now trying to do the reverse for Africa. You know, once you say, no, I don't want, nobody should come and take out raw cocoa, you have to come and they start pointing out to you various clauses and whatever that you've contravened, whether it's on the WTO and so on and so forth. But I think we'll have a stronger voice if we speak as a continent rather than as individual countries.
Thank you very much. On to you, Mr. Shoni.
Okay. In 2021, I published an article titled Uncertain Future for Democracy in Africa and the Middle East. And in that article, the crux of the article was that on two fronts. The first front was that there seems to be a nostalgia for democracy in Africa, particularly since many people realizing that Africa has been trying to penetrate. Democratization has been trying to penetrate in many African systems, and it doesn't seem to be working. So, which also saw what recently happened in Mali and Burkina Faso. Coup d'etat in Guinea. Those were things that we all thought were behind Africa, but we see them popping up again. Those are all that bring discouragement to the effort of democratization. However, when it comes to the context of democracy and development, I believe firmly that the correlation is not very strong. I don't think it's strong. I think it's important to give your people freedom because it positions them to think freely, and once people think freely, there'll be new ideas, new issues, new creativity, innovation, and whatever it is to spur development. But at the same time, the most important tool for development in any country would be to invest in your people and to build strong, reliable, independent institutions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. A lot has been said and great ideas, but let me just caution against what's emerging as an option for us. When you promote FDI, foreign direct investment, a lot of people feel it's the right thing to do, so if there is high FDI inflow in your country, you feel happy. But it is also a trap, because it simply means your country is a site at which the investment of other people is taking place. What about your own investment? And chances are then whoever came as a guest investor through FDI can say, thank you very much for your great hospitality, and now I'm going back home. And then what do you remain with? So let's not glorify FDI too much. Right? And just as I said, let us try to industrialize our countries. Today, the world generally is talking about the fifth. I think they are now in the fifth industrial revolution.
Yeah.
No, they are now at fifth, sir. There was first, second, fourth. Recently, I was studying around this matter. I saw there is a fifth. I don't know harmony between machines and human beings and things like that. Now, at what stage is Africa? Are we first, second, third, fourth, or fifth? None. I can tell you none. And that is our tragedy. And now some of our people talk about, IT, digitalization, we are now fourth industry. Who is fourth? We in Africa, are we? So we need, honestly, brothers and sisters, to do everything we can to industrialize our society. Now, the connection, brother here has talked about connection with development, is an interesting subject to think about. But the truth of the matter is that when you develop your society, citizens feel the socio-economic gain. They even become disinterested in politics to the extent that they will not agitate and disrupt the system. They might not even turn up for election because they will be happy, comfortable, they will be satisfied, they will be preparing 6-course breakfast. They have no time to go for elections. Similarly, they have no time to go and engage in activities that will disrupt the political system. In fact, in some countries now, elections, voting is being like encouraged, please come and vote, please. But people are already comfortable with prosperity. So let us not worry about that. Let us promote industrialization. Let us build democracy. They will meet somewhere, and Africa will be a great place to live in. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, we're grateful. I see you have a question. You may have to save it for later because time. I just consulted the Master of Ceremonies. Is not our friend. We're very grateful to... His hand is still up. That is one insistent questioner. All right, let's hear you. Do you have a microphone there? No? Let me quickly bring this to you. All right. Please make it snappy. Very snappy.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Amin Dasara, and I'm from IFED Global. The professors have raised an interesting topic, and I have a position which I want to put it out to them and suggest to them to see how best we can, as Africans, chart our own path of democracy to promote economic development. So they mentioned that we should chart our own path to democracy that promotes economic development. A democracy that has a positive correlation with development. So the question is, don't we think that the frequent change of governments in Africa within 4-year term, mostly, is not fit to propel economic development? Because when you consider countries like Singapore, Rwanda currently, there is some kind of stable and sustainable government that charts their path of democracy to improve development. So don't you think that we should also adopt that model of a long-term government that can improve development in Africa?
Thank you. I think we get the thrust of your question. Long-term versus 4-year, 10 years, 6-year, 10 years. Indeed, he has a point. How long has Kagame been in office now? Rather long. And he makes mention of him. What do you make of that? Do we need that to sustain development? I don't know whether you would want to hazard anything on this. No? Okay. Then we can call the session to an end. B. Elias Shonian is a former Deputy Foreign Minister, Republic of Liberia. We also had Professor Ludeki Chweya, CEO, Kenya School of Government. You got us laughing at a point. Very serious issues you brought to bear, though. And Senator Ibrahim Hadejia, member of the Nigerian Senate. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining this panel. Please, let's put our hands together for them. My name is Benjamin Akakpo. Thank you for your time. I hand over now to Mr. Maidu.
One more time, let's do it for them and for Benjamin as well. I told you this was going to be fascinating, and it has been.